Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the March 7th meeting of the Los Gatos Town Council Joint Parking Authority and Redevelopment Agency. I would request, first of all, that we all turn off our cell phones or turn them on vibrate for the rest of the evening. I appreciate that. I'd ask Madam Clerk to please call roll.
Councilmember Stephen Leonardis.
Here.
Note that Councilmember Barbara Spector is not here tonight. Councilmember Diane McNutt.
Here.
Councilmember Vice Mayor Steve Rice.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Joe Brzezinski.
Here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the privilege tonight to have one of the members of our young leaders with us. I'm going to introduce Morgan Brost, who's a Los Gatos Youth Commissioner. Morgan's right up here in front with her mom. She's a 9th grade student at St. Francis High School. She participates in student government. She's a member of the National Charity League. She's also a journalist for Mock Trial, and she's gone to all the trials and taken notes, and then as a result has 24 hours to write an article in 500 words on the trial. She says it has been a lot of fun, and appreciate that. A budding journalist. That would probably apply to the members of our community who are with the Weekly Times as well, and Los Gatos Patch, and our newest All Things Los Gatos, which we're going to hear about in a little bit. She plays lacrosse, she does gymnastics and snowboard, she's a guitarist, she sings, and she likes drawing, and she's fluent in Mandarin Chinese. Then in the afternoon, she, okay. So, Morgan, would you come forward, please? And will we stand for the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's thank Morgan. Adios. And one more time to acknowledge Morgan for being here. Next item on the agenda is our closed session report. Madam Attorney?
Thank you, Mayor and council members. The council met in closed session and took no action this evening.
Thank you very much. Now, for all of us in the audience who want to participate by speaking to the council tonight, I'd ask that you pick up one of these buff cards that is in front of you, fill it out, and bring it to our clerk over here. Again, that's for any of the items on the agenda that you want to speak to. The first item for us at this point is council and manager reports. Council, are there any council matters we wish to report on? Seeing none. Mr. Manager?
Yes. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I have a couple items. First, the Planning Commission this coming Wednesday night will be starting early at 6 p.m. One of the agenda items pertains to the Dittos Lanes apartments, and I wanted to share with you the new conceptual design for the new gateway to the Los Gatos Creek Trail from Main Street. So this will be distributed to the Planning Commission and Council over the next few days. In addition, the town has a new frequently asked questions available on the town website regarding the Dittos Lane project. Second, daylight savings time springs forward 1 hour early next Sunday morning. This is a good time and an opportunity for us to remind our community about the council's ongoing focus on personal emergency preparedness. The recommendation is that we use the time change as the opportunity and reminder to change the batteries in all of our smoke detectors, as well as in your flashlights, and to update your home preparedness supplies with fresh water and canned goods should a disaster strike during the next 6-month window. Last, we have a series of upcoming events here in the council chambers over the next 2 weeks. Our newest artist is now displayed here before you, and our monthly Art in the Council Chambers reception is this Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. Second, on Thursday, March 17th, the Public Utilities Commission is hosting 2 community forums in this room on the area code change, which is on your agenda for later this evening. Those hearings will be at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. And last, on Friday, March 18th at 6 p.m., the library is hosting again in these chambers, again, its its monthly program, this one called Mom Loves You Best with author Kathy Kress. So that concludes staff report. It's now my honor to introduce tonight's Did You Know? The council will certainly recall that your update of the general plan directed a focus on senior services, and then last year the council adopted a change in programming and lease of the neighborhood center with the Los Gatos Saratoga Recreation Department, both as a matter of fiscal prudence, but also to increase programming and services to our senior community. Back for a repeat performance is Stephanie Douglas from the Los Gatos Saratoga Recreation Department, highlighting some of the new senior services being offered in our community. Stephanie?
Thank you. Good evening, Town Council. So I just wanted to give you a few updates about what we're doing with the 55 Plus program. First and foremost, we've renovated what we like to call a community living room. It's a great space over at the Adult Recreation Center that has a flat screen TV, complimentary coffee throughout the day, lots of reading periodicals, and it's just a great place to sit around and chat and socialize, maybe watch a little bit of Oprah, and everyone's welcome to enjoy that space. And we're continually looking to improve it, so we welcome any feedback about ways that we can add items to that room to make it more enjoyable for everyone. Also, we do have a big focus on health. So one thing we're doing currently is expanding our Thursday health days, which include not only blood pressure screening, but also a sit and be fit class, in addition to having a healthy lunch and a speaker that will come and talk about a current health topic. And we've been getting a lot of interest in that, so it's an exciting new development for us. We're also expanding our partnerships, and currently we have a partnership with ElderCare, and they're a group of professionals who have come together the first Friday of every month, and they provide basically any type of information or resources that you might need. They specialize specifically in things that have to do with transition, whether it's from retirement, from working to retirement, or living at home to long-term care, or anything in between, transportation, housing, legal advice. So it's a great service. It's free. First Friday of every month, 9 a.m. to noon. Last but not least, we've updated our newsletter, and one of our seniors creatively came up with the title Senior Twitters, and this is available on our website. You can also get it emailed to you for free, or if you would like a hard copy, it's $15 a year, and we'll send it to your home. And this will give you the latest and greatest information, and we encourage all of you to look at it. And with that, if you have any questions or if you'd like more information on our program, you can contact me at 354-1514 or check out our website. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. That brings us then to the consent calendar. These are items that we can approve in a single motion. I'd ask first, is anyone on council interested in pulling the consent item? But before we do that, just make sure you're aware that item number 10, there's a desk item related to that, that makes one small correction in item 10. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at that. Any item the council wishes to pull? Seeing none, any member of the audience wish to pull an item from consent? Seeing none, then I ask for a motion. Madam McNutt?
I'll move approval of consent items 1 through 11 and 11.1.
Okay. It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. That brings us then to our first public hearing. I'm sorry. It brings us first to verbal communication before our first public hearing. And we have two individuals who would like to speak on verbal. The first, I've kind of given you a forewarning of. It's Alistair Dallas, who's going to talk about local websites. Welcome, Mr. Dallas.
Good evening. I'm Alistair Dallas, 17681 Foster Road. Is this better?
Better.
Thank you. I'm always nervous standing here. It's been a while. I'm here tonight to remind the council and more importantly the wider audience that there are some wonderful websites that are dealing only with Los Gatos, focused on Los Gatos news and information. I started I think the first website about the town 5 years ago. So I'm very interested in this subject, and I'm very pleased to be back doing this sort of information for the town. But there are several others at the same time, and I would like to recommend that the council and anyone who can hear this check out these different websites. If you're not familiar with The Patch, for instance, that's a full-on news and information site for the entire town. It's as full-featured as any newspaper. I'm very impressed by it. The bottom one there is my new blog, All Things Los Gatos, which is just me, but I'm reporting on things the way I used to in my old news site. And the other one that I particularly want to point out is Live in Los Gatos. We're very interested in real estate here in town, and Live in Los Gatos and Los Gatos Voice are both run by realtors talking about real estate issues and development issues in town. So they're all of interest to anyone in Los Gatos, or anyone who is interested in Los Gatos, and so I wanted to come and make that statement.
Thank you, Mr. Dallas. Any questions for Mr. Dallas? I think Los Gatos Patch is Los Gatos Patch without the dot.
No, I don't know if anyone's here from...
Yes, actually.
There she is. It's with the dot, right? As it is here? Okay.
It's fine, thank you. All right, the next is Michael Calise. Welcome, Mr. Calise.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you again. My name is Michael Calise. I live at 247 Edelin Avenue in Los Gatos. Been a resident for 12 years. And I'd like to take a brief moment to give an update for staff, management, and the council regarding electric vehicle charging station infrastructure within town-owned parking stalls. A couple of weeks ago, I gave a status report that Mr. Capurzo and myself and a qualified, certified electrician and installer of electric vehicle charging stations did a survey of the Los Gatos town. And that was a successful survey. We were pleased to see that there was some very compelling locations for electric vehicle charging stations. And the key there was they were at very low cost because of their proximity to electric metering and power, adequate power. At that time, 2 weeks ago, I didn't actually have the quotes in hand for what those numbers would be. We knew they'd be cost effective, but we didn't have a number. As of this time, I submitted the quote on behalf of the installers to staff and management, and perhaps some of you have seen the CCs, but if not, it was determined that for 3 highly viable, very adequate stall locations, one on the south lot in that very little corner across the street from the toll house, one behind Steamers, and one right behind Los Gatos Brewing Company. For all 3 of those locations that are within good proximity to accessibility and ADA stalls, that total cost would come in for installation at less than $6,000 for the entire cost. And if the town felt that it would want to perhaps expand a little further, if it made sense that staff and management recommended that, behind Los Gatos Brewery for another $2,000, you can get some good expansion capability and save costs long term, so roughly for $8,000. The equipment's still in line based on my last conversations with people who are involved in the granting procedures, that if we were to submit grants, we would likely, as a town, would likely be capable of receiving free equipment. And it is also quite possible that even that $8,000, that there's a good chance that up to $7,500 of that money could actually be supported as an installation grant from the California Energy Commission, therefore leaving the town with, for a 5-year plan, well less than $5,000 and even maybe a couple of $1,000s to deploy this great initiative in support of federal goals, state goals, and local goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Calise. I have no other cards for verbal communication. Does anyone in the audience want to submit one at this time? Seeing none, then we're going to go to public hearings. Our first public hearing tonight is item number 12, and this is a request to consider an appeal of a decision of the Planning Commission to uphold the decision of the DRC approving a 2-lot subdivision on Pennsylvania. That's at 381 Pennsylvania. We're going to have a staff report, and it's Ms. Mosley who's going to give that report.
Thank you, Mayor. The subject site is located at the southeast corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and Wissahickon Avenue. The existing lot size for the property is 24,433 square feet and is currently occupied by a pre-1941 single-family residence, a detached legal second unit, a pool house and a barn that were both built in the 1950s, and a detached garage that was rebuilt in 1996. The applicant is proposing a 2-lot subdivision. The proposed lot sizes would be 13,081 square feet and 11,352 square feet. The proposed lots meet town code requirements for the R18 zone in terms of lot size, lot frontage, and depth. The average lot size in the area, excluding the subject site, is 9,949 square feet. Oops, sorry. The subdivision would retain the existing historic residence as well as the guest cottage and two-car garage. Prior to the application for the subdivision, the property owner submitted a minor residential application for an addition to the main house. The application was put on hold by the property owner, and late last week, staff received a formal withdrawal of the minor residential application. The property owner originally submitted an application for a certificate of compliance to legalize 2 lots that were created in 1892, along with an application for a lot line adjustment. Based on the documentation provided by the applicant, staff determined that a certificate of compliance could not be approved. Staff directed the applicant to either provide additional documentation to support the requirements of the Subdivision Map Act to legalize the lots, or to modify the application to a 2-lot subdivision. The applicant revised their application and filed for a subdivision. The Development Review Committee held a public hearing for the proposed subdivision on November 16, 2010. Since the application met all town requirements and the required findings to deny the subdivision could not be made, the DRC approved the application. The decision was appealed on November 16, 2010. The appeal was considered by the Planning Commission on January 26, 2011. The Planning Commission denied the appeal and upheld the approval of the subdivision application by the Development Review Committee. Their decision was based on the considerations that while the main residence is considered historic by town code, the property is not, and the application would not impact the structure. The subdivision application would not impact the structure. They could not make the required findings to deny the subdivision. During the review by the DRC, the following Planning Commission hearing, the neighbors' concerns were in regards to the application's impact to the historic property and neighborhood, and the compatibility of the proposed lots and future residents. Additionally, their concerns in regards to the potential new residents were the potential increase in noise and traffic, reduction in property values and privacy, and impact to private open space, predominantly for the appellant at 371 Pennsylvania Avenue. Staff has provided responses to these concerns, and they are contained in Attachment 1 of your staff report. The Planning Commission's decision was appealed on February 1st, 2011, with the justification that the Planning Commission erred or abused its discretion and that there is new information that was not available at the time of the Commission's decision. Staff has provided specific information in regards to these statements within your staff report. In addition, staff received additional correspondence from the appellant's representative on March 3rd, 2011, provided as Attachment 13 within the staff report. The correspondence provides additional information in regards to the history of the property. Staff recommends that the Town Council remand the subdivision application to the Planning Commission for further consideration, and that an environmental assessment be completed prior to further consideration and action by the Planning Commission. The appropriate resolution for this can be found in Attachment 10 of the staff report. Other options the Council may consider tonight are to deny the appeal and uphold the decision by the Planning Commission and DRC to approve the application. The appropriate resolution for this option is provided as Attachment 11. Alternately, the Council may grant the appeal and deny the subdivision application. The appropriate resolution for this option is included in Attachment 12 of the staff report. The Council must make at least one of the required findings to deny the subdivision based on the Subdivision Map Act. Those findings have been provided within the staff report. This completes staff's report. I'm here if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mosley. Any questions of council for staff? Madam McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple of things. As I went through the reports that we received from the historic preservation experts, and I was looking back at the historic records inventory, I found myself starting to get confused on the term guest house and whether or not it was referring to the secondary unit on the site, which I would consider to be the guest house of the property. But then I thought, no, maybe it's referring to the main house as being a guest house when it was part of the original property before that was subdivided. And then I thought maybe I wasn't sure where I was going. So can you clarify when we're talking about guest house, what we're talking about?
The report references both. In some areas, it does mention the guest house or the legal second unit that once was the barn for the main residence on 381 Pennsylvania. But it does also reference the 381 Pennsylvania is also known historically as the McCullough Guest House. But it was referencing additions that were not actually proposed to the second unit. So it references
meaning guest house of the original property before it was divided up, before this was divided off of it.
There were additions proposed to the main residence known as the McCullough Guest House. Those were included in the minor residential application and were withdrawn late last week.
I understand that. Yeah. And then the historic records inventory, can you just talk a little bit about how that's been used by the town in reviewing applications and what it means when it says appears eligible or recommended for further investigation? Because this was done in 1991. Were all these properties further investigated, or how do we use this?
I think there's multiple questions in there, and I'll answer some of them. The staff uses the survey that Ann Bloomfield did in 1991 to help assist in analyzing additions, remodels, and demolitions that are presented to staff, and to determine what historic characteristics certain properties have and what process certain applications go through. As you know, our current residential design guidelines allow certain categories within that survey to go directly through staff, and then some to be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Committee. The categories, such as 5S in this case, were actually, they related back to, I believe, state document that no longer is relevant, but that's where those categories come from. There's levels of those categories that, if Wendy would like to fill in for any additional.
The only thing I'd like to add to it, so when staff does utilize this as part of the typical review process for a demolition, an addition, any type of application that could involve a structure, they verify first if it's on the list. Oftentimes, not often, but sometimes we do find that some pre-1941 homes are not on the list. We add those to the list. Dependent upon the results of the survey, then we would process the application according to that. So if the survey indicates that it was locally listed, for instance, there may be a different process we'd go through. We take it to the Historic Preservation Committee then versus going right on to DRC or onto the Planning Commission. If it's listed as being eligible, then we would process it a different way, and it would not necessarily then go to the HPC. So we do utilize that to help guide us on how it should be processed. The survey itself has the rating system, and the rating system really ties, it actually gives an overall rating for each property, and that rating helps, it's called a cumulative rating, and that helps you determine whether it is eligible for the National Register, the State Register, a local register, or that's not eligible. And in this case, this one ended up a rating of 39, so it's listed as contributor to the district, but it could be eligible for a local registration. It doesn't appear that that occurred, though.
That's all for now. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff? I would just like to comment about one thing. There was a document that was submitted dated March 2nd. I think it was submitted last Friday. And actually, there's a series of documents that's contained as attachment 13 in our report. And would the staff comment about that? Is there any comment that you need to make at this point in time? The council has received and read this, and I would just wonder if there's any issues that you'd like us to be aware of in relationship to that new documentation.
Do you want me to go ahead? When staff reviewed this, we did feel that this raises some new information that wasn't presented to the Planning Commission and that staff was not aware of. So it did warrant us to look at whether we should then recommend that this be referred back to the Planning Commission, and it does raise the question of whether environmental analysis should be conducted. So we felt that to be prudent, that we, in following CEQA, that we think it makes most sense to go ahead and review it back, refer it back to the Planning Commission, because again, we need to further assess this information and whether additional information should be prepared based upon this. So it did make us change our recommendation.
All right, and just for the clarification of our public, the original project was deemed categorically exempt from CEQA when it was first reviewed, and so the reference that Ms. Rooney is talking about is a direct relationship to that, and has revised then our need to take another look at the CEQA. All right, any other questions? Then I think we can go right to the public. And I have only one card. Now, just for your information, I would expect anyone who is going to speak to this issue submits a card to our clerk, okay? So I would appreciate that. And the way we will process this, we will hear from the appellant first. The appellant has 10 minutes to speak to the issue, and then the applicant will speak for 10 minutes. We will have then a period of public comment, each for 3 minutes, and then finally 5 minutes of rebuttal or affirmation from the applicant, and then the appellant gets the last word, again for 5 minutes each. My recommendation is that should you not need to take your full time, that would be fine. We would not hold you to that, but we do want you to feel free to give us as complete an explanation as you possibly can, and then after that we will deliberate. So I have the one card, and I think another one's going to be coming, and this is Mr. Haberkorn, who is the appellant, and my assumption is during this 10 minutes that we will include any members of the team for each side during that 10 minutes before we get to our public comments. So, Mr. Haberkorn, the mic is yours for 10 minutes.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. Thank you for your time. And not only today, but also in meeting. A couple of you have met with me or talked to me on the phone. I appreciate that. My name is Matt Haberkorn. I reside at 371 Pennsylvania Avenue with my wife, Catherine, who's here in the audience. And we have 3 children together, Brian, Colleen, and Kylie. We are opposed to the subdivision at 381 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I want to submit, based on the documentation submitted by council on March 2nd, along with the 2 expert reports prepared by Ward Hill, as well as a woman by the name of Paige, I forget her last name, but Paige Swartley, with regard to the CEQA issues and the categorical exemption. I also want to indicate that I'm speaking on behalf of a group called Citizens Advocating Better Planning, who that group is also represented by council, representing myself and my wife. I want to go through, or first tell you what I'm interested in council determining tonight is we look at the staff report, which has 4 recommendations or 4 alternative recommendations. The first one is that the town remand the subdivision application for further consideration. We're not interested in that. Obviously, I appealed based on what the Planning Commission ruled or voted on at the last hearing. The second thing is an environmental assessment be done, or a neg deck. We're not interested in that. We believe that there's been enough evidence shown from our experts, and nothing to controvert the 2 experts' written opinions, to require, in my opinion, as well as my counsel, an EIR, as opposed to just a neg deck. And the other alternatives that the Planning Department came up with is deny the appeal and uphold the decision of the Planning Commission, but I don't think there's been any evidence to indicate that that is appropriate here. The last alternative, which would be okay, but slow the process down, presumably if Mr. Howell plans to proceed with his subdivision is to grant the appeal and deny the subdivision application in its entirety. What we are seeking is that the appeal be granted as far as the administrative process is concerned, and that it be sent back to the Planning Commission, and that a EIR be prepared pursuant to CEQA, and to see if this, in fact, could be subdivided pursuant to California law. I wanted to mention there's been a few letters submitted in support of our position, as well as some oral testimony at the Planning Commission, as well as at the DRC. The only thing that I've seen from Mr. Howell, the subdivider, has been, I believe, 9 or 10 letters. And I just want to point out to the council, as well as members of the public, that each letter was unsigned. We've never seen these people in person. They appear to be canned letters, but each one is from either a local developer or realtor in the neighborhood. The only letter that is signed is from Ducky Grable, who most of us know as a local realtor. The interesting thing is her parcel that she mentions in her letter concerning the ability that she had to build a second home off of Pennsylvania Avenue back, I don't know how many years ago, was at that time, that lot that she built her house on was a 2-lot subdivision, if you will. It had 2 APN numbers. The lot that we're talking about at 381 Pennsylvania Avenue has 1 APN number, and it's been 1 lot. In my mind, legally, it's been merged since 1892, and then the Subdivision Map Act in 1893. It was never recorded as 2 lots. So I don't believe that we need to get into whether or not the Map Act applies. I just wanted to mention a few of the points that the Planning Department brought up just now. With regard to the PowerPoint presentation, it mentioned accessory buildings were built in the 50s. We have no evidence of that. The council has no evidence of that before them. We don't know when this barn was built, when the second guest house / cottage was built. The garage, we do know, that's a non-conforming garage built in 1996. With regard to it's new information to me today that the formal withdrawal of the minor residential modification was done, I guess, a week ago. It's interesting on the PowerPoint presentation, the Planning Department indicates that on February 1st, new information came before them in terms of our appeal. The new information was the Jane Bloomfield report from 1991-92. I don't know how that could be new information. It was new information to me, but in fact, the Planning Department is part of the town, and the town retained Jane Bloomfield to prepare the historic inventory, and in fact, she did. And here we are 20 years later, and the first time that this has ever come up, the Jane Bloomfield report, was when I found it following the Planning Commission meeting, and therefore it became new information to me. But I believe that it's incumbent upon the town to somehow look at every property and say, yes or no, this is something on the inventory, or like Ms. Mosley indicated earlier, that if in fact it's a pre-1940 something house, then you look at it. But we're talking about a house that's been here for at least 100 years, if not longer, and it was listed by an expert hired by the town, and I believe that that's truly not new information. It should have been information that was revealed to not only myself as an opponent of this subdivision, but also members of the public. Let me just clarify what you indicated, Ms. McNutt, with regard to the guest house. The home at 381 Pennsylvania, the main home, has been referred to as the McCulloch Guest House. McCulloch, as you know, is the McCulloch Jones house up on Overlook that's occupied by 2 gentlemen that the town is very well known, knows well about them. The McCulloch Guest House was actually the house that was occupied by Frank McCullough's sister. I think it was Mary McCulloch. And then across from her at 380 Pennsylvania was another home that she owned as part of the whole McCulloch estate, or McCulloch James or Jones estate. So when we talk about guest house in the report by our experts, the historians, the guest house that they refer to is not the McCulloch guest house, but the guest house / cottage on the property. And we don't know when that was built. I know that the Planning Department says sometime in the 50s. We don't have any evidence, documentary or otherwise, that says it was built at the same time as the house in the 1890s, 1900s, or built 20 years ago. The barn is in the rear of the property, completely separate. My understanding is that the cottage slash guest house is, or has never been a barn. The barn is in the rear of the property, and no one knows when it was actually built. There's been no testing done to determine that. And with regard to whether or not the home is historic or the property, I believe we addressed that adequately in the reports from the two experts. With that, I'll submit on that.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Haberkorn? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Haberkorn. You will have 5 minutes at the end. Now we'll hear from Gregory Howell, who is the applicant. Mr. Howell.
Good evening. I wanted to go over the fact that the DRC did approve this project, and we also received unanimous approval at the Planning Commission for this project. The new information that came in at the last minute on the, I believe it was the 3rd of March or thereabouts, with the reports, I have not had a time to thoroughly go through them, nor has my counsel. And based on that, we are reluctantly agreeing with staff that we feel the best course of action here is to deny the appeal and send it back to planning. And that is not obviously my first choice. I'd rather have the approval tonight. But I think that, to be fair to everyone, that it's probably the right course of action. There are some to create the initial study will take off the table any uncertainty about the status of this property. And so I've agreed with staff all along throughout this process and reluctantly agree with the assessment at this point based on the information that came in at the last minute. I would like for all of us to be aware that this is going to continue. We're going to continue to get stuff at the last minute. That is a strategy, obviously, that they've developed. So we need to realize that, and at some point we're going to have to make a decision to cut it off, in my humble opinion. But we should give them a benefit of the doubt on this one and go back and do an initial study to find out if we do in fact need to prepare an EIR or not. And I would like to make myself available for any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Howell? Seeing none, now Mr. Howell, you may want to wait there just for a second. Any other member of the audience wish to speak now about this project for 3 minutes? Seeing none, then Mr. Howell, you want to rebut anything you said to this point?
Well, I want to add a few things. I know a lot of you haven't had an opportunity to go through the house. The house has been significantly remodeled many times over the years. And in fact, I think the people that originally built the house would probably not even recognize it today, except for the exterior and the front facade, which is an example of a craftsman-style house. The properties in back that were built in the 50s, how I know that is that I had the daughter who lived there on the property at the time. I met her out there, and she told me that they built those structures in the 50s. They put the pool in the 50s, they put the pool house in the 50s, and they put the barn in the 50s. And I don't know why she would tell me any differently. I also had to go through the house, and even she couldn't recognize a lot of the rooms from when she lived there in the 50s. I can only imagine the changes that have gone on since then. The back of the house is an addition that was done probably 20, 30 years ago. And so there's been significant changes to this property. It is certainly not in the pristine historic shape that it was when it was originally built. Keeping in mind that when the home was built, I'm not sure they even had plumbing back then or any bathrooms that were in the house. They would have had an outhouse, and right now there's 3 bathrooms. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands that this house has already been through many changes. We're not proposing any changes with this application. We're proposing a subdivision and to subdivide the property.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Howell. Any other last-minute comments or questions? Thank you, Mr. Howell. And then Mr. Haberkorn, come back to the mic for your 5 minutes of last words.
Thank you. A couple comments. Number one, there's no strategy here trying to bring stuff up at the last minute. I believe, as you, Mr. Mayor, know, I explained to you what happened, that I found that I got lucky, I guess. I went down to the library maybe it was a day after the Planning Commission meeting, and happened to find the Jane Bloomfield report after calling someone who was a historian who said, well, if that home is historic, it's got to be in the Jane Bloomfield report. And I said, who's that? And he explained to me that she was hired by the town. So as far as last-minute information, this is information that should have been made available to me as well as Mr. Howell when this whole process started approximately 6 months ago. And apparently there's no tickler in the system to notify the planning department that this is a house that was listed as and designated as a 5S, potential historic, and so for historic home as well as property. So we're talking for 20 years the town has known about it. So there's nothing last minute. Yes, it was last minute to me, but how am I supposed to know this stuff? I mean, I would think that it would be something that comes up. I will note that it is on the Hooked on Los Gatos website with the historical information. The house is mentioned. It's mentioned that it was a bell ringer. It's mentioned that it was built sometime between 1892 when the subdivision first took place until maybe the 1900s. It was modified. And that's when Mr. McCullough bought the property along with or bought the house along with the house across the street at 380 Pennsylvania Avenue. The other thing Mr. Howell mentioned is that, again, he'd like to deny the appeal. I believe that we're entitled to the appeal being upheld, or not upheld, but the appeal being granted, and that the matter be sent to the Planning Commission or started fresh with an EIR, not a neg deck. I believe that an EIR is in place, and I believe that council relied on the report of Paige Swartley, and she specifically says that we have, first of all, we know that a categorical exemption does not apply, but she specifically mentions, and I believe it's at beginning at page 7 of Paige Swartley's report, where it discusses CEQA and the historic impacts, that this entire property is historic, in her opinion, and there's nothing to controvert that before you today. So in that regard, I believe that it's incumbent upon the council to issue a ruling upholding my appeal, and therefore sending it back down to Planning Commission with strict instructions that an EIR be conducted with regard to this subdivision, and that it not be taken in a piecemeal fashion as it's been done to date with regard to let's modify or do a remodel of the house in the rear, but let's not change the front. Let's put that on hold. Let's do a lot line adjustment. That was then pulled, and now it's a subdivision application. And according to the experts, both experts, you cannot look at this in a piecemeal fashion. It's illegal. It violates CEQA as well as other laws. You have to look at it, and the applicant has to actually prepare plans for the subdivision to show what's going to be built, to see if there is, in fact, an impact on this property as a whole, because it's been there for 100+ years. And I want to add to that that this property is the size it is, as well as our property, which is I think it's approximately 18,000 square feet, and the property downhill from us is another significantly large property. These properties were subdivided back in 1890s, okay? We're taking this area called the Glen Ridge Park, which we have the subdivision map that shows it in 1892. The town planned to provide bigger lots for people that didn't want to live down below, right in downtown, on these smaller lots with basically 0 lot lines, where your neighbor, you could almost reach out and touch the neighbor. These homes were built up in the area to give people more elbow room. And I believe when Dallas was talking, he mentioned some papers. Both of the realtors' websites that he pointed out in the PowerPoint presentation talk about the Glen Ridge Park area. And they mentioned the fact that you could move to that area if you didn't want to live in town, if you wanted more elbow room. If we start subdividing in the Glen Ridge Park area, you're creating a precedent that we're just going to extend the downtown and chop everything up. And you're going to lose the charm of that area being above downtown. And that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Habercorn. Any further questions for Mr. Habercorn? Seeing none, thank you. We'll close the public portion at this time. And I would like then the council to declare any meetings or visits. I myself did have a meeting with Mr. Habercorn and have visited the site twice on a perimeter visit, not on the property itself, but at the exterior of the property. Anyone else have anything to report? Mr. Vice Mayor?
I've been to the property, and I had a meeting scheduled with Mr. Habercorn at his request, although today, in light of the current recommendations from staff, that meeting was canceled by him.
I also visited the site. I also had a meeting scheduled with the appellant, but there was some snafu, and so that didn't happen.
All right. Yes.
I had a meeting with Mr. Habercorn and his wife, visited the site. I also spoke to Mr. Howell on the telephone.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Now, a couple of clarifications for staff. We have a staff recommendation that, in effect, I believe is being affirmed by both parties, that we take a look at this new information related to the historic characterization of this property, and expert witnesses who've submitted this to us. I hear one party saying we should uphold the appeal and the other party saying we should deny the appeal, and both end up in basically the same place doing those things. I would like to ask our attorney, is there an issue with our moving to the recommendation of discovery of new information and forwarding, returning that to the Planning Commission, since that is one of the requirements we have to maintain our process, and that is new information requires a return to Planning Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. The town code allows you a variety of options this evening as set forth in the recommendations, while the applicant urges you to deny the appeal, uphold the decision, and still return the matter back to Planning Commission is an option. The appellant asks you to grant the appeal, but begin the process again and have the matter returned to Planning Commission. And what the staff is recommending and allowed by code is, based on the new information provided to you, and specifically the materials presented by the appellant midday last Thursday, staff is recommending that you neither grant nor deny the appeal. It's within your ability to just refer a matter back to Planning Commission as an administrative matter.
All right, so that would be without prejudice at that point then, correct?
That's correct. All parties will still have the appeal rights once Planning Commission makes a decision.
Thank you. And the other comment I want to make was just to look at the recommendations from the appellant's witnesses. The first being Ward Hill, whose curriculum vitae was included to indicate his level of expertise. And in the first paragraph of his statement, midway through the first paragraph, actually it's the second paragraph, if you include that, I'm an architectural historian with 31 years experience, that's a paragraph. The statement, an initial study should be prepared for the project because there's a reasonable possibility that the project may cause a substantial adverse change in the significance of the historic resources, and it moves on from there. And then in the submission of Paige Swartley, who is also one of the appellant's experts, this is in the second paragraph as well, at the bottom of the second paragraph. After talking about the exemption, the categorical exemption as being inappropriate, Page indicates, accordingly, the town council must deny the categorical exemption, prepare an initial study, and conduct a thorough CEQA review of all related projects at 381 Pennsylvania. It seems to me that these individuals who are indicated as significant to the submission of new information for the Planning Commission are indicating an initial study be begun. Where will the initial study take us if we use that as the recommendation?
What staff is recommending is that staff be allowed to conduct the appropriate level of environmental review necessary. What staff will be doing is referring the matter out to a environmental consultant who will then conduct an initial study, as is done in other environmental review matters that come before this council. And at that point, it will be the consultant's recommendation whether or not, as opposed to trying to predetermine it this evening, it will be based on the environmental consultant's decision what level of environmental review to conduct and whether an EIR, a mitigated neg deck, or a neg deck comes back before the Planning Commission when the matter returns, if that is council's desire.
All right, thank you very much. All right, council, discussion or motion? Madam McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll go ahead and make a motion. I have to say, I think that Planning Commission did analyze this correctly, given the information that they had at the time. In my 8 years on council, anytime we've talked about historic, we've talked about structures and not an entire property, and including the backyard and the front yard and the whole property within the boundary lines. So this is kind of something unusual for us and a new way of looking at it. I found the comments from the experts to be intriguing, and I do think that we need more information. So my motion would be to follow staff's recommendation to remand this back, subdivision application back to the Planning Commission, and that the directing staff to do the environmental assessment prior to the Planning Commission's further consideration of this matter.
All right, and just a clarification, and this is neither to deny the appeal nor to grant the appeal.
That is correct.
All right. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion of the motion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you very much for your participation, everyone. The next item on the agenda is item number 13. 13 is a review of an area of town that we are looking at very seriously as a result of our earlier council retreat. And this is the Almond Grove District and the condition of the streets. We are being asked to accept the staff report and then to provide direction to staff regarding implementation. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Capurso.
Mr. Mayor.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. We have a neighbor. Mr. Leonardis, would you like to let us know what you intend to do?
I need to recuse myself from this hearing because I own a property in the district being talked about this evening.
All right. Appreciate that. You're duly recused.
Thank you.
Now we can go forward.
Very good.
Our numbers are shrinking as we speak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. It's my pleasure to be here before you tonight to discuss the Almond Grove Street Rehabilitation Project. We've got a presentation for you this evening, and then we will wrap that up by talking about some of the budget figures and phasing and construction numbers which are in your report. So to start, before we start this out, I would like to recognize that we have a desk item on that I believe has been distributed. It is the final version of the consultant's report, which we just took delivery on probably in the last hour. So you have that before you now. So with that, let me give a little introduction. The Almond Grove neighborhood is located just west of the downtown area. I think most people are aware of that, but just in case. The streets and infrastructure have been a concern to the town for several years. Funds were first allocated to evaluate the condition of the streets back as part of the 2009-10 capital improvement capital improvement program budget, but more as a pilot program to evaluate various construction methods. That project was not carried forward as is, but the funds were carried forward to 2010-11, and the project was rescoped to become a more comprehensive study and approach, not only of the streets in the area, but also of the accompanying infrastructure, most notably the curb gutter and sidewalks. During the 2010-11 budget process, Council expressed a preference to widen the area of study and have staff take a look at a larger geographic area. So at that point, the area of study was expanded to the south to consider Broadway, as far south as Broadway, and as far west to include the hillside streets and the far west end of the area. Our methodology includes a full assessment of each street in the study area by construction type, an assessment of various construction methods, and a recommended phased approach. In order to undertake this task, the town solicited proposals for such work and entered into an agreement with Nichols Consulting Engineers. The preliminary results of their work were shared with Council at the Council retreat on January 22nd. The main points discussed at that time were that the total work involved had a order of magnitude in the $18 to $19 million range, and it also assessed the difference in the construction cost and of different methods between asphalt and concrete. Also discussed at that point were a variety of potential funding sources, and reported that the full report would come back to Council on March 7th. And here we are. One other note that came out of that was that Councilmember Leonardis raised a question about Royce, which sometimes gets overlooked, and so we did include Royce, not necessarily in the study, but it is considered in our financial analysis as well, so we finally picked up Royce. So as I said, here we are back on the 7th. Before turning it over to our consultant to review the results of their work, I'd like to make a couple of quick introductions. We have Ryan Schaefer here from Nichols Consulting Engineers, and of course your town manager, your town engineer, almost got Kevin a promotion there, your town engineer, Assistant Director of Parks and Public Works, Mr. Kevin Rohani is here as well. So I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Todd. So, I think what we were tasked to do with working with Kevin and Todd very closely was to do this comprehensive study of the Almond Grove District. And this is just sort of the kind of boiled down version of our study and what we're planning to do. And that is really just to look at all the surface, all the infrastructure within the street right-of-way and evaluate what it would take to rehabilitate or reconstruct those surface features in the street right-of-way, including pavements, sidewalk, curb and gutter. The study did exclude the utilities, though, because from understanding working with the town, is that those utilities have been recently rehabilitated and taken care of, and that those are not part of our study. But everything else, basically from basically back of walk to back of walk, we looked at that. We quantified it, measured it. So this study is very accurate. It's done street by street, and we looked at, as an overview, we looked at 10 of the PCC streets, and then 21 of the AC surface streets. And that's kind of how we broke the study, was based on the surface type. It's a natural way, a visual way of breaking the different street types into PCC, Portland cement concrete, and asphalt concrete. So, and at the end of that is to quantify all of that information and then come up with a cost estimate as to how the town might best rehabilitate or reconstruct all of this infrastructure is in the study. And that's what I'm going to go into greater detail. So this just gives you a quick overview of what the areas that we looked at. You'll see the streets that are in yellow. Those are the PCC surface streets. And then it's a little bit harder to tell on this the resolution here, but there's a couple of I'll point up here. These streets here, these are actually composite streets. That just means AC over Portland cement concrete, those streets. But the rest of the blue streets that you see there, those are AC surface streets. So that's how it's broken up. That's how we evaluated and took a stab at looking at the area based on surface type. And then you see the RDA boundary that's in the blue dashed line that surrounds the area there. Oh, thanks. Great. Perfect. So to look at the key criteria that we looked at, we put some of the important ones. These are not all of the criteria. There was a numerous list of things that we considered, but I don't want to belabor some of the smaller points. These are some of the key issues that we looked at. Basically, the tolerance of the community to construction and dust and noise, basically the impacts to the community. That's a big part of a residential neighborhood, has to be very carefully considered. So that in looking at the different types of reconstruction alternatives and rehabilitation alternatives, we considered that. Impacts on local businesses, that's a huge part of this town. Also looking at green alternatives. We can't ignore the fact that there are a number of different paving solutions out there that are more greener than others. And so we definitely consider those opportunities as well as the constraints of those different types of rehabilitation and reconstruction methods. Of course, ADA compliance is a part of any street evaluation, looking at curb ramps, percent cross slopes, those sort of issues. Again, at a study level, this is not at a design level. Also looking at right-of-way issues, again, very minor right-of-way issues at the curb ramps. There's some areas that are tight where properties are up against ADA ramps, so that's very typical for cities. So again, we looked at those issues. They're quantified. I mean, they're not precisely quantified, but they're expected, and so we built those into some of the costs that we looked at. And then construction phasing, definitely considered how to logically approach this. You have, X million dollars of work. How do you logically break this up into chunks or phases that you can attack this work at? But also taking into consideration some of the impacts to the community, making sure that you don't completely cut off traffic or completely take away the ability for people to park near their houses. So a logical phasing was considered as well. Lastly, the two is capability of local contractors. You have to make sure you don't introduce some proprietary method or some way of that's great. It's a new type of recycling technology. Can any of the local contractors actually do the work? And looking at also at life cycle costs. PCC, again, the major costs are your Portland cement concrete streets and your AC resurfacing. That's where primarily all of your costs reside. And you want to make sure you compare apples to apples. You want to look at the costs, what they are today, but you also want to look at the costs down the line, what it would take to actually maintain and rehabilitate these streets in the future. So I just want to, speak in pictures, minimize the text, because I recognize that some of this information can be overly detailed. So I want to speak in pictures and in terms of what the existing street conditions are. For the AC streets, you see in this street here is Belmont. It was reconstructed back in 2003, so it's in good condition. But that's a rarity in the area in terms of the AC streets. If you see that there's one street that's actually in that condition in our study. So the rest of them, we'll talk about those next. In terms of the other AC streets, again, keep in mind there's 21 AC surface streets. You have 8 here that are in relatively fair condition. Again, they're starting to show their age and wear, starting to show different types of distresses. Here you can see it's pretty subtle here in this picture, but this is alligator cracking, pretty typical of this type of street. Again, you have 8 of these streets. Palm is this picture here. Here's the streets. This is probably the worst condition streets that you see. And I work for a lot of cities and counties, so you should feel blessed to have that this is your worst street in a particular study area, because this is some of the best streets, and I see a lot of cities and counties. So here you have 9 streets that fall in that condition. But again, these distresses would indicate you're nearing the end of this road and that you're needing to rehabilitate it or reconstruct it. So that's what we looked at. And again, this is Peralta. Here we have the composite streets. Again, this is just a way of saying AC. It's basically, they came and paved asphalt concrete over PCC. So the distress patterns that you see on PCC, which is this block cracking, you can see the underlying slabs of PCC underneath. It's just reflecting right up through your AC. And that's representative of 3 streets, one of them being Glen Ridge. In terms of non-pavement elements, what we looked at, not only in addition to the primary costs that were the pavements, we looked at also all of the non-pavement elements. If you look at these 4 that I've highlighted in green, that's again for the non-pavement assets. This is where the majority of your costs reside. You have sidewalks, curb ramps, curb and gutters, and driveways. That's where the majority of your work. We also looked at striping, utility covers, storm drainage features, trees, and other minor traffic calming elements, medians, those sort of items. But those, again, were all quantified. We had our engineers out there measuring and taking quantities on each of these items to come up with a representative replacement or rehabilitation cost for each of the streets. In terms of, just to give you examples of your streets or your sidewalks here, you have utilities that have to be considered that are buried within, that are actually encapsulated within your sidewalk. So you have to consider those in your costs. It's a little more expensive. You have tripping hazards, very typical of residential areas with trees. You have issues where the PCC gets pushed up by tree roots. And then you just have distressed concrete. And that, overall, the sidewalks, we looked at in general condition. You see over here, the general condition is poor to fair. So again, older PCC sidewalks, and that's the general condition within the network of streets that we looked at. Curb and gutters, a similar picture. You've got distress at the edges here, cracking along your curb, and then you have some broken up curb here as well. There are some sections of curb that are in much better condition that have been improved by residents, of course. But as a whole, the general condition is poor to fair. And so what we looked at in our study was basically replacing most of the PCC curb and gutter and sidewalks and driveways for cost estimating purposes. Now, there may be larger portions that may be able to be saved, but I think that where that would be looked at would be in the course of actually doing detailed design when you develop design documents. But for an overall study like this, I think it's a fair assumption to assume replacement of all those elements, curb and gutter and sidewalk. Again, it gets cost ineffective to replace do a piecemeal replacement. It's more cost effective for a contractor to come in there and to replace all of those elements at the same time. So here is the curb ramps. Again, they're just typical curb ramps that we took pictures of. Here's some encroachment issues, that you'll have to deal with a tree and a tight property boundary up against your ADA ramp. Here you have a ramp that comes in flat. You have a tight property here. It's missing a detectable warning surface. Here is a curb ramp missing a detectable warning surface. These cross slopes are not ADA compliant. So the general condition is non-compliant. And again, I feel for cities and counties because the ADA compliance tends to be a little bit of a moving target with, they tend to add another element. I hope we're at the end of that cycle. The detectable warning surface was the last piece to be added. So a lot of your ramps, even if they have, the cross slopes are meet ADA compliance, even though this one doesn't, they're not compliant because they're missing the detectable warning surface. So majority is non-compliant. Driveways, again, we just had to look at this because, again, there's a lot of sidewalks that are going to impact driveways. It's not the predominant condition. Most of your properties have on-street parking and do not have a lot of driveways, so this wasn't a big part of the cost. But again, these will all have to be considered. Again, we counted and quantified and came up with a typical replacement cost for those driveways. So, and I apologize for the annoying animation here. One of my staff, I think, gave me a little bit of surprise in my presentation. But the ones that you see blinking, and as I'll describe more, these are what we looked at as the final recommendations. And so what we looked at, we broke it into basically how do you approach rehabilitating or reconstructing the streets? And that is, you approach it by the condition. That's the logical way to break it up. So the streets that are in good condition, you can receive slurry seals, microsurfacing, surface seals. You're probably very familiar with that type of application on your good condition streets. The fair condition streets, and obviously that would be a recommended treatment. You get a lot of, by actually doing preventative maintenance, you actually protect those streets that are in good condition, you preserve them, and you prevent them from being more costly rehabilitation or reconstructions down the road. So that's a recommended treatment. Fair condition pavements, we looked at overlays, both rubberized hot mix AC and then conventional hot mix. Also looked at cold in place recycling. This is sort of a newer technology that's becoming more prevalent in the Bay Area. It's very prevalent in Southern California. It's basically where, if you've ever see a street get milled and then overlaid, well, what they do is they actually mill the material, they actually mix it in place, reintroduce an emulsion right in place, and place it right back down, and you can have traffic on it in 30 minutes. So it's a great technology because it's just urban mining. You're going out and mining your existing aggregate that's already there, placing it back down with emulsion, and then putting a wearing course on top of that. So it's a great technology. Where it's more cost effective is long arterial streets, substantial width, good quantities, straight streets that are easily accessed. So the downtown area, the nature of the downtown area here would be difficult to apply this technology because small quantities, smaller street size, and also there's a considerable amount of noise associated with this. So this is a really good application that we see most typically for arterial streets. So we did look at that though. It's a great technology, just didn't recommend it for the town. I don't think it's appropriate for the residential area with limited length. Poor condition pavements, we looked at a variety. This is where your big cost is. So you want to spend a lot of time here making sure you got the right options considered. We looked at reconstruct with Portland cement concrete on the PCC streets only. So basically, remove the PCC and put back PCC. It's a good option. PCC lasts a long time. These streets have been around for 40, 50 plus more years. They're at the end of their life, of course, the PCC streets, but this is a good treatment. It's a little more costly. Historically, it's been perceived as being more costly, but I'll take you through some of the costs that make it actually very competitive with AC. But this is a good option. There's also reconstruct with AC. We looked at a variety of reconstruction methods, full depth AC and AC over AB. Very, very conventional, very typical for a study like this. Again, these are good treatments for both the PCC and the AC streets. Great, we recommend those. They're very conventional. A lot of contractors can do this type of work, and it's cost effective. We also looked at two other ones that you maybe have not heard of, perpetual pavements and full depth reclamation. Perpetual pavements is just a very comprehensive pavement section that allows it to last for 40, 50, 60 years with only minor overlays. So you're basically on big arterial streets where you don't want to impact the community and you want to have minimal treatments in the future, you put down a very expensive pavement section that prevents future cracking, and you only have to do occasional overlays in the future. So it's a great technology. We're seeing it in a lot of arterial streets, but again, long stretches, big roadways, big arterials, not appropriate for a residential community. The last is full depth reclamation. It's just the same as cold in place recycling, except that now you're milling out all of the AC material, all of the PCC material, and you're basically grinding it all up into place and putting it back as a pavement section. Now, I mentioned that you can do AC, but it's very hard to incorporate much PCC with full depth reclamation. It's very difficult for that material to be processed, very hard. It's hard on the machinery, typically not done when there is an appreciable amount of PCC. So, all in all, for the reconstruction, again, would not be a good bet for the town because, again, residential neighborhoods, limited length, not cost effective due to the quantities. There's noise issues, and with PC streets, it would be prohibitive to do this technology. So next. So in terms of the cost analysis, we tried to keep it, again, there are so many different alternatives and ways that you can look at this, but to boil it down to what the final recommendations that you saw that were flashing in the previous slide, we looked at the total costs for PCC streets. These are the current street types, PCC and AC. So for the PCC, we said, let's look at replacing it with like in kind, with PCC. The cost there would be $12.9 million. Looking at over the next 50 years, what would be your meter maintenance costs? $5 million. And looking at the PCC streets, if we reconstructed with AC, various methods, the costs range from 11.9 to 12.5. But here's the big point, is the projected maintenance costs in the future. AC streets want to receive slurry seals. They want to receive rehabilitation on a pretty regular cycle. That's just that, you know, the nature of seeing probably your city engineer recommend resurfacing on AC streets. They just require more maintenance. So that's the downside of replacing with AC. And this delta is actually surprising because we actually got some quotes from contractors. PCC has become a lot more cost competitive. This used to be a lot bigger difference, and a lot of people would still go with AC, given that the delta was so significant. They felt like the cost to put back PCC was cost prohibitive. But it's interesting to see the costs come very close to each other, and then to look at these projected maintenance costs in the future. I think it makes, as we see in our report, the PCC is pretty attractive solution. Finally, looking at the AC surface streets, looking at what we did, the majority of the streets were in fair condition. They can be rehabilitated. The poor condition streets can be reconstructed with AC. These are the range of costs, and these are the future projected maintenance costs. So these are, again, the final cost analysis that we looked at, and the final recommended treatments. So looking at also the construction phasing, I think is important. This is just a very preliminary 4-phase approach to the project, basically looking at disturbance to town residents, impacts to the community, not cutting off or isolating areas by the construction, and also putting it into phases that are approachable for a city or a town to take under its belt with a budget. Obviously you don't have maybe $20 million to approach the first phase of work, and it would be very difficult for a contractor to complete all that work in one summer. You'd almost have to hire several contractors to do that much work. So it's a logical way to break up the construction phases. And again, what we recommended was reconstructing in phase 1 was the AC rehabilitation and PCC streets. The second phase was picking up the remaining AC rehabilitation streets and PCC streets. The construction phase 3 was looking at AC reconstruction, and the last phase is PCC reconstruction. And you'll see a little bit more of this broken out on the next slides. So in terms of construction phasing, I wanted to break out, give you a sense of the cost. Again, phase 1 is $5 million. Would be for phase 1, and that would include several of the PCC streets getting reconstructed, as well as a portion of the AC streets getting rehabilitated. Again, it's a good idea to rehabilitate as much of the AC streets as possible, because take advantage of their current condition and rehabilitate them and prevent them from going into worse condition. Phase 2 is about $6 million. Again, picking up several more PCC streets, remaining portion of the AC rehabilitation streets, and some reconstruct streets for AC. Phase 3 and 4 was just a logical phasing of the remaining streets that there was a natural break of the remaining AC reconstruction streets and the remaining PCC reconstruction streets. That's how we broke it up. And you can look at the phasing map. It makes a lot more sense as to how we selected these streets. But again, these are very preliminary ways of breaking up the streets into phases. And again, if you look at the total costs, as in the previous slide, this includes construction, contingency, design, management, inspection, and admin fees. So it's the total cost. It's all put into these numbers. And that is all I had. Hopefully it kept your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Todd.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So we have some conclusions to draw from this. Well, first of all, the magnitude of the project is obviously very large, $18 to $19 million, and it's really dependent upon construction methods, but there's not a wide range of there, as you've already heard. So because of that magnitude, the phasing becomes a necessity, and to determine that, we actually considered a variety of factors. Among those were street usage, not just from vehicles, but from pedestrians also, and we also considered street condition. What you hear from Ryan, and it's all true, that virtually all of the PCC streets require reconstruction. There's not anything that can be saved, but even given that, there are some that are just plain old in worse condition than some others, and so we did factor that into our thinking behind the phasing. The AC streets, as he mentioned, there are some streets that still lend themselves to the more conventional preventive maintenance opportunities, and we would want to do that in a timely manner with cost avoidance in mind. So if we can capture a street at a slurry before it becomes a candidate for an overlay, we'd like to do that as well, because that will protect the town's investment and save us money along the process. The funding strategies, we have a variety of things that we mentioned at the council retreat back in January. We gave you a one-page handout on this project. It talked about a variety of funding sources, RDA funding as a potential sale of town assets, savings from the library project, and use of the parking reserve. Those were all potentials, as we mentioned before, but they're also going to be potential funding sources for other competing projects as well as we develop our CIP over the next few months. There's also an ongoing project that I believe you all know about in the capital improvement program, and that's something that we typically use for our AC streets, and that's our annual street repair and resurfacing project. Last year we did a very successful Cape Seal project in the Belgatos area and the Arroyo Grande area. We showed you a video on that a few months back. I think you all liked it. We're also currently evaluating several neighborhoods throughout the town for various resurfacing work next fiscal year using that same project. There are some A streets in this study area, particularly those around the Bachman Park area and in the upper west side hillside streets, that would be good candidates to be best combined with that work. The PCC streets are probably going to have to stand on their own because they don't lend themselves to that same sort of economy of scale with our asphalt work. So coming back to the report before you, we have two pretty basic recommendations. We would like you to accept the report and then to provide direction regarding implementation and budget preparation. As far as implementation, we'd like to get your feedback, especially on construction type and your thoughts on the phasing approach. As Ryan mentioned, we can put a approximate dollar value of $5 million on phase one. I should point out for you, though, that as you start doing the math with different funding sources and looking at the maps where the RDA boundaries go, about $4.5 million of that work is actually within RDA boundaries. Somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 is outside, and that work is AC work, and that's some of the work that we would look at to taking into our annual contract. I think the street that we recommend for phase one on that is actually the AC section of Bachman. So at this point, there's lots of info for you to consider, and Ryan, myself, and Kevin are all here to take your comments and answer questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and appreciate the very thorough presentation and preparation for us. Before we go to public, we have one comment card from public. Questions for staff on what we've heard so far. Councilmember McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I have several questions, if that's okay.
Please.
So I'm not sure who to address this to. And if it's all right, I would like to refer to them as concrete and asphalt as opposed to your acronyms, just to make my life a little bit easier. Can one of you discuss the difference between concrete and asphalt treatments in terms of time of construction, noise of construction, dust, or any other impacts to residents or the community at large?
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to look to Ryan for that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think the main considerations is probably cure time. You know, with your PCC, you're looking at, 4 to 7 days, depending on what.
I'm sorry, can you use concrete or asphalt
concrete.
for me? Thank you.
Absolutely. For concrete, you're looking at a cure time. So you're going to have to let that stand without traffic being back on it. So depending on what type of mix you use, there's a variety of mixes. You're probably looking at, somewhere around the 4 to 7 days that you have to wait for that to cure before you can get traffic back on it. Whereas asphalt is much easier to get traffic back on within a day or so. Both reconstruction methods are going to be disruptive in a sense that you have to remove the existing section. You're going to have a temporary road surface, and then you're going to place that material back. You're going to either place asphalt or concrete. So I think the fundamental difference probably comes down to the cure time and having the amount of time to get traffic back out and people parking back out on their streets. Noise and dust. Again, it's construction. It's going to be fairly similar levels of disturbance in terms of noise, dust. I'd say it's mostly the time to get people back out on the streets.
Okay, and if I
Please,
might
keep going.
continue. Also could, and this is, I think, a Todd question, could you talk about your plans for educating and engaging the community? So that would be residents and adjacent businesses, as well as people who visit those residences and visit those businesses. How are we going to let them really become familiar with this?
Well, at this point, we don't really have a definitive project scope to talk about. So I'm going to assume that we get to that point and we proceed with some level of a phase 1 project, whatever that means. We'll obviously have to do all of our normal courses of neighborhood outreach, which would not only include the residential community, but the adjacent business community as well. And by and large, that's the easy part to do because we do that all the time on other projects. We do a fairly good job of that. It's more difficult to inform our if we have visitors to our residents and our downtown and visitors to our downtown businesses as well. So we would have to do a fair amount of signage that might even go as far out as being on the freeways. We'd probably have to do some level of public awareness campaign. I'm not sure to what extent at this point, to be quite honest, but at the very least, I think we would work with our chamber, our town website, and take all the conventional means. But when all else fails, we would have to use some of the same methods that we use for some of our special events. We may end up with signboards on some of the arterials. I think if we're focusing more on residential streets and not working on arterials, the likelihood that we would have to put signboards out on the freeways is probably decreased, but those signboards would probably have to be on North Santa Cruz and Highway 9 and Winchester coming from the other direction. So I would see us using those methods at this point, unless something else comes up during the construction phasing that we're going to hit some strange, popular route that goes through there. We'd probably have to do something different. We'd also have to engage folks who live outside the street, because our focus would be to work with the residents of the streets in question. As Ryan said, those are the residents that will take the brunt of the impact in terms of noise, dust, disruption, but the adjacent streets will take the brunt of the traffic in the interim. So there'll be temporary increases to traffic on the other north-south streets or east-west streets, and we'd have to do an equal amount of outreach to those blocks and those residents as well.
And then my last question or comment, this appears to be a really great and thorough report, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to actually read it. Sure. So I'm not going to be able to comment too much tonight on the construction phasing because this is all new and haven't had a time to really digest it or go out and visit the streets. But just based on my perception, and I have to say that I spend more time on the downtown Almond Grove area than I do on the upper areas. It just, again, anecdotally, it just feels like Almendra, Nicholson, being that they are horrible condition and they are affecting the residents
everyone who lives up here who drives through them, everyone who travels those streets to access businesses, churches, schools, and so on in that area. So my initial reaction when I saw the color-coded phasing on page 32 is I was surprised that there weren't more red lines, meaning phase 1, covering that area, that it was spread. So I'm not sure that there's a question in there unless you want to, again, try to explain a little bit more as to, and I guess I also was surprised that some of those areas are actually phase 4, which would be the last ones to be tackled. So can you comment on that at all as to what the thinking is on that timing?
Yes. The replacement of concrete streets is an expensive proposition. And so to put all the concrete streets in any one phase would be a phase that we likely couldn't afford. So we have to give some level of prioritization. We did focus on a couple of, or one street in particular that's a prominent north-south route. If we were to add, I think, some of the streets that you mentioned, there'd be a corresponding drop-off in concrete streets, other concrete streets that are already red. So it really becomes, do we want to take a geographic approach, or do we want to take long stretches of straight roadway? It's a little more difficult than to say that that you're absolutely right in that all the streets you mentioned are in poor condition, but there are some asphalt streets in this equation as well that we would be better served, at least financially, keeping it in financial terms, we would be better served addressing those sooner rather than later. So the intent is to catch all of the asphalt streets that have any potential for rehabilitation in the first 2 phases. Now, I think where it becomes an either-or is when you want to talk about phases 3 or 4. What we did is we put all of the asphalt streets, all of the remaining asphalt streets that were reconstruction in phase 3 and the concrete in 4, and those could easily be swapped out. I don't think there's any magic against those, but that was the thought in not including every street in that, because this will cut off those routes for extended periods of time, and we'll have that extended cure time if we go with concrete. So that was the thinking. It's not definitive. That's really one of the reasons we're here. So that's a great comment. But I mean, those were some of the considerations that went into how we phased it.
And I understand it would be so much nicer if we just had 20 million and could do the whole thing. Yeah. But not.
Okay. Any other comments, Vice Mayor Rice?
Question on, let's just pick a street like Bachman or Tate. We're essentially talking about a property line to property line rehab. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. We talked about or you mentioned the cure time of the street being 4 to 7 days. What is the cure time from the street to the property line?
Yeah, so basically your impacts to your pedestrians and how they would get back on that. That you can, again, depending on the mix that you use, but in terms of getting people back out, you're talking maybe 2-3 days. Again, it just depends on what type of mix and how much you want to spend on that, on concrete mixes, because the quicker the cure, usually the more costly they are. So again, you're probably not talking about as much time as 4 to 7 days that you would see with a piece or a concrete street, because that's for load traffic as opposed to just pedestrians. So, but there would be some impacts there. But again, when you get into the design documents, the way we typically handle reconstruction projects is that you phase it. You can do maybe one half of the block, or you could do this side, the east side first and then the west side, so that you can maintain pedestrian flow, or you maybe look at another pedestrian route that people can use in the meantime. So those sort of things get fleshed out certainly during design, but that's a great question.
So if I can follow up, in essence, if somebody doesn't have a back entrance off of an alley or whatever, it's potential that they could be either stuck in their house or unable to get to their house for 2, 3, 4 days at the most.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, we can break, the blocks can be broken up in a way to allow access, and we can certainly look at quicker cure mixes that allow people to get faster to their properties. But again, we didn't look to that level of the sidewalk cure time.
Okay. Yeah. I'll have more comments later, but
okay, thank you.
It's good for now.
First of all, I appreciate the comments made so far. I think they're very appropriate. What is our cure time on the sidewalk reconstruct that we are doing throughout town at this point?
It's about a day.
About a day.
Right.
And why does it take a day when the proposal is, 3 or 4?
I think for the sidewalks, it's probably not 3 or 4, but I think in trying to answer the question about driveways and curb and gutter,
right,
because a curb and gutter and a driveway approach is going to take the traffic load, and you typically will pour a thicker sidewalk at a driveway approach. So in our work that we do now, as one of our standing projects is sidewalk replacement, as you know. And it varies. I think on some of our driveway approaches, we're probably looking at a longer cure time. And even when we say that we take the single day and don't allow pedestrian traffic, we often end up with a little bit of etching in the concrete here and there. Mm-hmm. So it's probably not completely cure. It's cured enough to walk on, but I think having an extra day certainly wouldn't hurt matters. And I think if we're going to be out doing this level of investment, we'd probably have to build some measure of that into our inspection and our quality control that manages pedestrians off for, say, 48 hours and vehicles off for some level, whatever we settle on, whether it's 4 to 7 days. But we'd certainly want to build that into it.
You're right. I'm assuming security would have to stand by there. It's just too tempting. But I do know that we have a relatively quick cure on most of the sidewalk work that we're doing. We do. At least that's my appearance. I think that there's a theme here, and that is that the impacts are going to be very significant, and we have to be proactive in mitigating those impacts. And so the shorter downtime, the better off we'll be. What is in the terms of timing for let's say the Delgados paving project? That was a fairly extensive project with a lot of shorter streets in a neighborhood not dissimilar. Didn't have curbs, I don't think, but there's no sidewalks in some places. But what was the cure time on doing that slurry seal or the Cape seal that we did out there?
I'm going to look to Kevin to correct me, but I think we were in that 24 to 48 hour window, and I think it was also a function of temperature. Okay. That's about what it was. That was a surface treatment, obviously. So we've got several asphalt streets in here that would lend themselves to the surface treatment. The ones that would require an overlay, you can typically get on them a lot quicker than that. So sometimes same day, depending on the time of day, but at the worst case scenario, next day. But
that's just the overlay.
Overlay, right? But the reconstruction of a street, whether it's asphalt or concrete, has an extended downtime. Obviously, with asphalt, you can work with it more, so you can drive on it at various points where half a lift is done or a partial lift is done and allow traffic, and then you come in and do the final lift. You don't have that option with concrete.
Correct. And then I do want to talk about the question of the long-term costs. The relative long-term costs, because from the statistics, it would seem obvious that you're supposed to do concrete, given the very large dollar estimates on maintenance over 50 years. I am intrigued with that idea, but I'm curious: are there any downsides to concrete when you lay it and then let it be for 50 years? What are the difficulties that occur? Because my impression is that we've done an awful lot of work up there in the Almond Grove, doing repairs. It's a patchwork, It also serves as a traffic calming methodology, apparently. But the question I have is when you do an asphalt street, and then you have to do, let's say, undergrounding or utility work or something like that, what are the differences that occur in that particular the two different types of street, given the fact that we're going to be doing some cutting at a certain point?
That's certainly an excellent point, and to answer that, with the concrete streets in particular, you kind of already have you have great evidence of that already, because as Ryan has stated, once you build a concrete street, you've essentially put it out there. There's not any real preventive maintenance that you can do. So even the dollar figure that he shows in his table of, I think it was $5 million over a 50-year period, that's really not what you would call preventive maintenance. That's probably more repairs that would be related to things like utility cuts and other the installation of ramps and other elements that, like we've seen up there already. So you would find over the longer period of time that if there is a need to trench down a street, install a new sanitary sewer or a new water main, it would be replaced with a cut that you would never really be able to cover over. It would be, you know, in theory though, it would be a better construction street with a better construction trench, which is not what we have now. In fact, what we have now, probably the places on the street that have been trenched are the best part of the street. As opposed to the asphalt streets, with once you make the cut, you can come in there and do some level of removal, replacement, repatch the street, pave the street, and it might look a little funny for a year or two or five, but the next time you come in and do your slurry seal, your cape seal, your chip seal, it becomes invisible. And I think we saw a lot of that in the Arroyo Grande and the Belgados area, where we had even the alligator cracking, that when we put that rubberized mix down, the chips, and then a slurry coat over that, all the evidence of that is gone. So you do pick up something on the aesthetic side, if you will. And you know, I love streets, so I find them aesthetically pleasing. But not everybody can make that claim. If Ryan wants to add anything else.
Yeah, that's a common issue. In fact, how San Francisco deals with that issue is they have composite streets. They put AC over concrete. But that's, you know, for a lot of these streets that they're talking about, that's where they're expecting numerous utility cuts over the years. You know, you can just imagine all the utilities in San Francisco. So that's how they deal with that issue. They also like having the combination of the best of both worlds, having flexible concrete over a nice, firm concrete base. So that's typically how they design it. Now that's a rarity. Concrete streets, I think also you probably, in the latter years of the concrete streets, that'll be a bigger issue, the cuts, because it'll be so apparent the difference that you have now. I mean, you just go look and you can find all the good condition pavement. It's where all you've done your utility cuts in your concrete streets. But the initial condition, maybe for the first 10, 15, 20 years, that concrete's going to look very good. There might be a difference in color for a little while, but you know, for the main point, you're just going to see that utility cut. So it's not going to be as apparent as it is now. But that's certainly an aesthetic issue. It's a good comment.
And Mr. Larson.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, your attorney and I were just talking as well about this question. One of the advantages we have with the magnitude of funding required, that it's going to take several years to progress on all of the phases of the project, is to do advance work and notice with all the utilities on the concrete streets that are going to be replaced, alerting them to that need for them to do any work they may have that they can foresee in advance of that, and then to begin exploring, maybe with Ryan or others, can there be differential fee schedules for penetrating different street services given the impact on the longevity and maintenance of that facility when we've done notice. So using sanitary sewer as a public agency, we let them know Tate's going to be done in this window, do any work you need done. Then there's a fee schedule that's adopted over the 50-year life of that street that ramps down, other than inflation, as the street goes forward for cuts, to look at mechanisms like that to create incentive and a sharing of the burden. So we don't know if it's been done. It's something we'll have to explore.
All right, and when we do some of the sanitary work or water district, they are the ones who are responsible for replacing the surface, correct? Maybe we could have them just do everything out there and replace it on their dime. All right, any other questions from council? I think that we are going to take a comment here from the public in a second, but this is a very significant project, probably the most significant public works project we're going to have in an awful long time, and it's absolutely needed. I mean, the people in the Almond Grove in particular have suffered through this for way longer than they should have, and I'm very skeptical about the concrete, and it's primarily because of the fact that the price seems so equivalent right now, and what happens in the course of time as the economy rebounds and and all of our concrete goes offshore, what happens to that price, and does that price differential change from 2011 to 2014 or whenever it is we're actually in there? I'd like to know that. I'd also like to know more about how a concrete street does deteriorate, because obviously the ones we've got out there didn't last their entire life expectancy. What is it about? When do we think they went in?
I don't know. I've been using a variety of numbers, anywhere from 40 to 70 years.
Okay, so
75 years.
75 years. Okay, so they passed the 50-year life expectancy, obviously, and then they must have just deteriorated overnight. But with that in mind, I would think that concrete is not going to just be pristine during the entire life cycle. That there are going to be some things that change. So I don't want us to assume that by choosing concrete, if we do, that it's going to look like a very clean, pristine street after a decade, because those things just do change. Look at any sidewalk we've got in town. Looks good really at the beginning, and then it changes because of all of the street trees and the residue that occurs throughout. So my inclination is to go with that which seems to be the most readily able to be maintained, and maintained in good condition, and so I'm kind of an asphalt guy, and I particularly like the fact that the cure time is so much less, because I think it's going to be one of the major issues is what happens out there when we actually try to make this happen. The Almond Grove is a great neighborhood, and it does have those, for the most part, those access points in the alleys, but if you've ever seen the parking on the Almond Grove, there are an awful lot more cars that are going to be there than fit in the alleys. And so that would have to be something that we consider when we take a look at the downtime for those streets. All right, I think I've said plenty. Anyone else have anything more to say before I ask our public to come forward? Mr. Miller, would you like to come up and say a few words?
Good evening. So as a lifelong resident of the Glenridge neighborhood, I thank you very much for taking a look at this, and also for looking at beyond just the Almond Grove area, looking at the Glenridge and the other surrounding mountain areas. In 1996, when I was a freshman in high school, I inquired with then Public Works Director Michael LaRocca about the street resurfacing, and I was told that it was not in the near future. Of course, almost 20 years later, that's, but nevertheless, I do appreciate the town's support in patching areas. I know the area in front of my house was patched earlier this year, so appreciate that on Ellenwood. My suggestion would be for you guys to look at the worst streets, even if it's outside of the RDA area. You look at Glenridge, voted a couple of years ago as one of the best streets in town by the Weekly Times, and then also, real estate agents claim it's one of the best neighborhoods. But the Glenridge in particular is just deplorable. I was walking my dog there a couple months ago and saw this lady trip on one of the cracks in the street, and it was, unfortunately, hopefully, she was okay, but it's just a liability as well. So I do, again, appreciate your taking a look at this, and that would be my suggestion, is look at what are those worst streets that are out there. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Any questions for Mr. Miller? Thank you very much. Marlene Rasmussen.
Thank you. This is what we present to the world. It says life is beautiful, and it's Los Gatos observed. Inside is your blight, and that's what you're dealing with tonight. So if you have any questions from an Almond Grove resident, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? In terms of, well, I mean, that particular magazine doesn't talk strictly about blight, but in terms of the Almond Grove, one issue that has been raised, and I'll raise it with you since you live in the Almond Grove, is the community awareness and interest in concrete, preserving concrete, or to continue to surface those streets with concrete because of the historic character. And do you have any opinion or inclination about what you would feel about that, or what your neighbors might feel?
Certainly, I have an inclination that the neighbors would not care as long as the streets were fixed. It's time. It is a blighted area. It's been deferred maintenance for 50 years now. No, not that long, 25 years at least. And questions were raised about the downtown impact on the downtown North Santa Cruz. The Almond Grove, Wilder, Massal, Tate, all endured and put up with North Santa Cruz when it was being resurfaced, and the noise in the middle of the night. And I'm sure those of you who were on the council at that time got many telephone calls because of the nighttime construction. So I'm sure if it affected them directly in front of their homes to make it, more beautiful and easier to get around in, that you would not receive that type of negative reaction.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Larson.
Just the subject of funding is one we'll be bringing back to you as part of the CIP over the next several years. It's worth noting, though, that the governor and legislative proposal to eliminate redevelopment would directly reduce funding that the town has for the Almond Grove rehabilitation over the next 5 to 10 years, and it is one of the reasons why this council adopted a resolution opposing the elimination of redevelopment just last month.
I do have one question, if I may,
Yes,
Mr.
please.
Mayor. At the end of your staff report under fiscal impact, it says to provide full funding, alternative funding approaches may need to be evaluated. If directed by council, staff can investigate and assess the alternatives and report back to the council with information on various funding options. And I guess I question why it was not in tonight's report, the various funding alternatives.
All right. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm assuming there is a response, but I believe it was just to look at the entire package without that included. Okay. Yes, Mr. Capurso.
Yes, our focus of this report was basically to go over the infrastructure condition. We were fully aware and anticipated that this would prompt a larger discussion. At this point, there's many unknowns, as the town manager just mentioned, particularly with regard to RDA funding.
Mm-hmm.
So we are hesitant to come to you with a funding proposal or a specific dollar amount to fund until we really know where we're going to lie with regard to that, and let alone our own internal funding that we use to fund our own ongoing pavement, our own pavement rehabilitation strategies. So at this point, that was not the focus of where we were at, but we wanted to give you that option that if you found it appropriate to direct us at this point, we would we would welcome that, but that's not where we were going with this report at this time.
Yeah, it was not my my thought that you were going to go there either. I think that this is a very complex process, and I think Ms. McNutt indicated it in her opening comments that if there were 20 million waiting around someplace, then this would be a relatively easy thing to do. But this is a very costly project, and we do not know what RDA is going to look like. We may know by Thursday, because that's when they're supposed to take a vote in Sacramento. But if it goes through that RDA is allowed to continue, then we have one vision of funding that we can look at. If it goes in the opposite direction, then it's almost as if all bets are off. So perhaps after that period of time where we can have a little bit more perception of what is available to us, then you will bring that report back to us. Okay? Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anyone on council? Then I believe this meeting is adjourned.